Hi everyone, this is a quick video on in-text citation. I will try not to take up too much of your time. I know you're hard at work on your papers, but I do want to cover this because it is one of the trickier things that students have to deal with, and it is also a very important thing to deal with in an academic context. Citation matters a lot. Getting the citations right is a major part of your grade on this upcoming paper, and it's a major part of impressing academic audiences. The paper that we're looking at right now is covered in another video. I'm not going to talk about the content very much, except to say it's a really good paper, but I do want to quickly point out the citation that the student uses. We'll look at a few different papers and a few examples of citations. So currently we are looking at the abstract that the student wrote. There is no citation in this abstract. It is often considered unnecessary in abstracts. I've seen it once or twice in professional articles where there might be a citation or two in the abstract, but usually it doesn't need to be there. But once we get down to the actual body of the paper, you will start seeing these little references. This particular student is using a name and date system. Some other systems call for numbers. We will talk about that shortly, but this is called in-text citation. There are two types of citations, and I know most of you are aware of this, but let me just, start from square one just to be on the same page with everyone. What we're looking at is called in-text citation. That corresponds to a different type of citation that is called bibliographic citation. If I go to the very end of the paper, I get a reference list, references, and here is the full bibliographic information for all of the articles that contributed to this paper. It's got the authors, it has the publications, the date, and I can go look up the article and read it. This is the one that we were looking up just above. Shen et al. 2016. That little et al. Reference means and others, the additional people who were co-authors on the paper. So that little Shen et al. Is referencing a much longer bibliographic entry at the very end of the paper. These two types of citation, in-text citation and bibliographic citation, work hand in hand with one another. As I am reading the paper, I should be able to say, okay, this is where this bit of information comes from. I can go look up this article and I can verify this information. Now, please note that this is not just used for quotations. I have had many students over the years assume that citation only applies if you're actually quoting somebody. That is not true. It applies if you are taking any sort of information from a source. Even if that information is conveyed entirely in your own words, there ought to be a reference for where you got it from. I'm going to skim down a little bit on this paper and just point out quickly how often the student is doing it. Once or twice per paragraph is usually considered sufficient. I will say that it is rare in a lit review that you will see a full paragraph that doesn't have at least one citation. Maybe once or twice. If you're dealing purely with your own ideas and sort of a synthesis of how you're thinking about the material that the paper covers, there might not be a citation in that given paragraph, but that's rare. Usually there should be at least one or two citations. Let's have a quick lesson on the different systems that are available to you. So these are various different systems of citation. MLA is the one that you probably learned in high school. That is because it was taught to you by an English major, and this is what English majors use. It is usually not applicable to hard science papers, but it is something that you're probably all familiar with. APA, or American Psychological Association, is something that you're probably familiar with, is acceptable in hard science papers. And notice there's a subtle difference between the format of these two. MLA calls for the author's last name and then a page number if available. APA calls for the author's last name and then the year in which that paper was published, and that's going to be acceptable in a lot of these systems. All of the ones listed below here, except for IEEE, use the name and the year system. Next one on the list is Council of Scientific Editors. This used to be called Council of Biology Editors, and if you were a biology major, then this is the one that you would want to use. With CSE and with ACS for that matter, both of these are kind of loose about the format that is required. You can look up the guidelines. They really do say do this or this or this. So with CSE, they want you to do Gibson 18. In other words, the last name of the lead author followed by the year of publication, or you can do a little number 3. That 3 would correspond to the third article listed in the bibliography, and usually from the perspective of a person doing the writing, that is going to be that number 3 is going to refer to the third article alphabetically. In other words, the one that comes up in the alphabet third. Whereas in a lot of professional articles, you will see it referring to the article in the order that it appeared in that paper. As an author of a paper, particularly for a university class, I would stick with alphabetical order, not order of appearance. Order of appearance is done often by editors of journals. It is not something that the authors mess around with. Let's address ACS really quickly, American Chemical Society. They say literally, you can look up the guidelines, that you can go with the author's last name and then the year. I guess I should make that a 2018 to be consistent. You can have it a little 3 in parentheses or a superscript 3. Any of those would be acceptable. IEEE, Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineering. This is what computer science students should use, and they do this. They have a little 3 in brackets, not in parentheses. I am okay with students using any of these. Well, I should say if you're in my hard science writing class, not MLA. I just put that up here because you're mostly familiar with it. But any of these others, I am okay with you using. I'm not so much concerned with format. I am very concerned with placement. So let's talk about placement for a moment. Okay, so the paper we are currently looking at is a sample paper that I use in my freshman classes, except that I have purposely gone in and messed up the format of the citation just to demonstrate a mistake that happens all the time in student writing. So in the original version of this paper, this paragraph actually had quite a few citations, like 4 or 5 of them. What I am showing right here is the pitfall that I see students fall into all the time, and it comes from a misconception that the in-text citation should come at the very end of the paragraph as is displayed here. So we look at this whole paragraph. There's lots of information there. There's hard facts. There is stuff that clearly came from some outside source, but there's no reference at all for what that source is. And then I get down to the very end and I see a little name and a year. The problem with this is that it leaves the reader in suspense throughout the paragraph as to where this information is coming from. If I, read these few sentences here and there is obviously hard content in those sentences, but there is no source listed, then I'm sort of in doubt about like what source it is that I'm dealing with. Ideally, let's say this whole paragraph, every bit of it comes from McWilliams, and in reality, this was from a few different sources, but let's say every bit of this paragraph comes from McWilliams, then I would want to place that after the very first sentence in which McWilliams plays a role. Let's put it right here. Let me show you another example from a professional journal. We are currently looking at a literature review that I have had students read in the past. I cut it from the syllabus this time around, but I still think it's a useful demonstration of placement. It's a review about a particular strain of bacteria called Helicobacter pylori that lives in the human gut, and that's maybe as much as you need to know about it. The point I want to make with this is that this little 72 is the source that carries most of this paragraph. We have the initial sentence here: 16 healthy persons and 1 person with a Zollinger-Ellison syndrome undergoing gastric secretion studies in Dallas, Texas became rapidly and profoundly hypochlorhydric. Hypochlorhydric means a lack of stomach acid. It's one of the side effects of being infected with this bacteria. 72 is the source that contributed to that bit of information. The next sentence is from that exact same source. 9 subjects had mild illness with abdominal pain, nausea, and so forth. And I won't read the rest of it, but what I want to point out is it is the same source that is contributing all of this information, but please notice that the author did not feel obligated to put in a little 72 after every single sentence. We don't need a citation at the end of every sentence. The expectation is that this 72 kind of clarifies the source that we're dealing with. If the following sentence is on the same topic and covering roughly the same material, then we assume that that is from the same source. Now, that 72 carries it all the way down to here, and the very last sentence in this paragraph is from a new source, that is 73. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying there's anything wrong at all with putting a citation at the end of the paragraph. Sometimes that's exactly the thing to do. But what I'm trying to say is don't wait until the very end of the paragraph to clarify what source you're dealing with. The 73 here cites only that very final sentence. The rest of this paragraph is coming from source 72, and notice that that follows the very first sentence of the paragraph. And then you've got a little bit of leeway to run with it. You've got, maybe say a paragraph or so that you could carry on with that same source 72, and not feel obligated to reinsert the citation. I will say, though, that if there's any sort of rule of thumb with this and you're in any doubt as to whether or not you ought to include the citation, there's a rule that you should follow. If you cite too much, you might get a little bit of an eye roll from the professor. The professor might think, oh, that's unnecessary, the student didn't have to do that, but the professor is almost certainly not going to mark your grade down for that. On the other hand, if you cite too little, it will definitely hurt your grade. And so if there's any sort of choice to be made here, is err on the side of citing too often, be a little bit more obsessive with it than not. Again, let's return to the sample paper on Parkinson's. Not that I want to read this paper or talk about it too much more than we have, but I just want to point out that several times per page, the student has references for where the information comes from. That is a goal that you should be trying to reach for. If you get through a whole page of your lit review and there's not a citation, that's a mistake. There needs to be a constant sort of little reference point for where the information comes from. If you have questions about any of this, you can get hold of me via Canvas or email, and hopefully this was helpful. Thanks.